Okay, so before we get going, a couple things I wanted to mention. Um, so we're looking at kind of Canvas here where we left off. We kind of finished Module 5 yesterday. Just as a reminder, those daily quizzes, if you're not attending live, are always due about 48 hours after we cover them live. So yesterday's daily quiz will be due before we start class tomorrow. And then the quiz we use today will be due before we start class on Thursday. That module 5 reading was due before class yesterday. We kind of had that module 6 reading due before today because we're going to start module 6 for most of the day today. We'll kind of be in there. I'll probably move a little bit slower through module 6 than module 5. We're going to be reusing a lot of the concepts from module 5. So we'll get some we'll kind of revisit those, especially at the beginning of class today. You will also see once I'm done with class, I'll kind of update module 5 and 6 here to include the next Canvas discussion. So I think if you looked at the tentative syllabus to start out, the due date was kind of set to be today. I didn't want to have it kind of overlap with the exam, so I postponed that. That'll be due at the end of the day next Monday, so 11:59. So you have some time to get on and do that. I will walk through the Canvas discussion more in depth tomorrow at the beginning of class. You'll see it posted after class today. So if you want to get started on it, you can. I might hold off on posting until you kind of hear me go through it a little bit more in depth tomorrow, but I think you can get a pretty good start on it. Um, and then I think that's the only other thing I wanted to mention before we get started here today. So I'll kind of revisit module 5. We'll then kind of jump into these module 6 slides. Other than that, any questions before we get started here? Okay. Um, so to kind of start out, we'll actually jump right into the daily quiz for today. So kind of revisiting some of the concepts we talked about last class, setting us up for some of the things that we're going to talk about today. We're loading. There we go. So we'll kind of work through questions 1 and 2 together. So we're thinking about initially what happens if we see taxes decrease. Okay. So last class, we kind of talked about the things that would shift long run aggregate supply and long run aggregate demand. So one of the things that would shift aggregate demand, and we said we can think about aggregate demand primarily as changes in expenditures. The easiest way to think about this is usually through consumers, the lens of the consumer, but we could also see changes in things that influence uh, any other component of expenditures, right? This is like our GDP calculation. So investments into capital, government spending, uh, net exports. So this one is focusing on if we looked at consumer taxes, and this would apply to producer taxes as well. So if we think about, we kind of start out, we've got real GDP, we've got our price level. We then said, all right, we've got this downward sloping aggregate demand and this kind of fixed long run aggregate supply, which represented when we were using all of our output, right? This was the maximum level or our potential level of real GDP. Okay. So initially, we have price levels here, our equilibrium price in the long run, and our equilibrium long run real GDP. We'll make a differentiation in today's module between long and short run GDP, but for the sake of kind of reviewing what we talked about last class, this was all in the long run. So what happens if we see a decrease in taxes? Well, remember, we want to think about this as if you are taxed a lower amount, you have more available funds to then purchase products. So the aggregate demand for products or for purchasing output is going to increase. So this is where we said increases are always shifts to the right, decreases are always shifts to the left, no matter what curve we're looking at. So you could also think about if these were business taxes, if I reduce business taxes, companies have more available funds to invest into capital. So either one of those would increase expenditures and increase our aggregate demand. So where is our kind of new long run equilibrium? This is going to be at higher prices But remember, the only thing that shifts long run real GDP are changes in my long run aggregate supply. So notice here, I would see prices go up, right? When it comes to long run GDP, there's really no change. Okay. So we're thinking about there, what's going to happen. And I might have accidentally said short run prices here. The same thing is going to apply to short run prices. We'll kind of see that today. But essentially, our prices will go up, and then our real GDP, we would see no change from this aggregate demand increase. And we could work through a similar example where we had a decrease. That's going to push prices down, but not cause our long run real GDP to change at all. Any questions on that idea before we move to the next one? So in the next problem, we're given kind of simultaneous changes. So the first change we're told is that if exchange rates improve. So that was another thing that's going to influence aggregate demand. Actually, sorry, not decrease. We said they improve, right? So exchange rates improving mean that we have more purchasing power, or we can think about it as the amount of available funds, the amount of goods we're going to be able to buy from other countries increases. So this increase in exchange rates is still going to cause this increase in aggregate demand. So we have an aggregate demand increase in this second problem, similar to that we had before, which we know is going to drive prices up, but not cause any changes in that long run real GDP. Now, I'm going to draw these on separate graphs. I drew them on kind of the same graph last class to kind of show you kind of what can happen in terms of why things might be indeterminate. But I think it's easier to kind of break these down, draw them out separately. So I'm actually going to leave some space up here. So let's think about instead, at the same time as this tax decrease, we instead have, so here's our long run aggregate supply. Prices start out here. Here was our initial level of real GDP. If we have labor supply decrease, okay? So if labor supply is decreasing, this was one of the factors of what we called this acronym POLE, right? The things that shifted long on aggregate supply were productivity. The category of other was things like improvement in physical capital, an increase in L would be an increase in labor supply. In E, we had increasing levels of education. So if we have a lower level of labor supply, right? Labor supply is decreasing. Decreases are shifts to the left. It's one of those factors of POLE. So we know it's impacting long run aggregate supply. So when it decreases long run aggregate supply, what happens? Well, our new equilibrium price level is higher, but our new real GDP is going to be lower. Okay. So if we're thinking about what's happening to short run prices, so we now had a decrease in long run aggregate supply. That was pushing prices up, but this was causing our real GDP to go down. Okay. So with certainty, we can say that real GDP is going to go down, but we can also say, right, that prices, because they're both pushing price in the same direction, we know that short run or long run prices, once again, we'll look at short run today. It's going to end up being kind of synonymous with our short run prices when we just have one shift. So we're going to see prices have to increase, okay? Because both of these changes would be increasing prices. Now, real GDP is going to go down. Right? We weren't asked this question, right? And then what do I have in the second one? So I want to change this. So in order for GDP to increase, the shift caused by exchange rates and compared to kind of the shift in labor supply would have to be what? So greater than, less than, what did I have? Does not matter is the way I phrase this. So if instead of looking at, if I'm looking at real GDP, sorry, this question should say not increases, sorry, this should be that it decreases. Okay. So what would guarantee what the relative size of the shifts are? Because that aggregate demand shift isn't causing any change in my real GDP. The only thing that dictates changes in our real GDP in the long run will be shifts in that long run aggregate supply. So if I was to ask you, in order for us to kind of achieve this real GDP decrease, what would have to be true? It doesn't matter, right? Even if this effect is smaller, it's still decreasing real GDP when the other was not. So kind of that second answer, right, should be that it doesn't matter. So if we're seeing that equilibrium GDP not increases, but instead in this problem decreases, it doesn't matter. Now, the other kind of thing I could ask, and this is actually, I think, what I initially wanted in this daily quiz, I forgot to go back and change it, just to kind of make this point, is if they're both pushing prices up, I could instead ask you which of these effects has to be larger in order for us to see a price increase. Well, once again, if they're both pushing price in the same direction, it doesn't matter which is larger. They're both going to be causing prices to go up. So once again, the answer there would be doesn't matter, right? So anytime they're pushing price in the same direction, the relative size of the change doesn't matter. If they're ever one of them is pushing price in, sorry, pushing real GDP, uh, if the longer aggregate supply is pushing real GDP down, because aggregate demand does not influence our potential or our maximum level of GDP, we, once again, relative size doesn't matter. So we went through some examples last class where we had simultaneous changes, and there it could matter which is larger in terms of whether or not we see prices go up. I'll go through an example here in just a second what that would look like. But for right now, since we're running a little low on time, you've got kind of 24 seconds remaining. We should see kind of an increase and remain the same for that first problem. And in the short run, we said we know prices are going to go up, and it doesn't matter which effect is larger or which shift is larger. So make sure you're kind of submitting this here next few seconds. Um, I'll go after the fact if you needed a little bit more time here for those of you who are attending live. Right after class, I'll go in and kind of adjust that to change anyone who was late just because of we ran up to close to that 10-minute time block. For those of you watching after the fact, you should have plenty of time to kind of make sure that you're completing this attempt. Okay. Any questions on that before I kind of add in one more wrinkle here? Okay. So let's instead, let me see here. Let's instead assume that I saw a labor supply increase. Well, so if I saw a labor supply increase coupled with this increase or improvement in our exchange rate. So we're going to keep the first change the same. So we had this improvement in our exchange rate. Actually, let me keep the colors consistent here. We saw an increase in our exchange rate. We said that increased aggregate demand, which pushed prices up, but caused no real change in our real GDP. So instead of a labor supply decrease, what happens if we saw a labor supply increase? Okay. Well, if we were to draw that out, I guess technically we could kind of memorize all of this, but I think drawing it out will always prevent you from making kind of errors or kind of having this, um, getting this flipped in your head a little bit. So here is my aggregate demand. Here is my long run aggregate supply. Okay. So initially where it starts out, so our equilibrium price level is here, our real GDP was here. So we already know the effect that the aggregate demand shift will have. What is this labor supply increase going to do? Well, that's going to give us more available workers to increase output, or it was one of the factors of pull that increased our long run aggregate supply. So what did that do to our equilibrium? It pushed prices down and it caused our real GDP to go up, right? So here prices are going down, real GDP increasing. So if these happen at the same time, it doesn't matter what the relative size is. We always know that the total effect would be that real GDP has to go up. It's completely dictated by that shift in long run aggregate supply. Shifts in aggregate demand do not change our real GDP in the long run. However, they're pushing prices in opposite directions. So, in a problem like this, the answer for what happens to price would be we don't know. It's indeterminate. If instead I gave you a question that was phrased this way, which is assume that prices went up, what would have to be true? Let me see if I can get this all on the same page. There we go. Barely. Here, let me write it here just so we have a little more room. So let's assume prices go up. Which of these would have to be larger? What would be the effect that is driving prices up? So if we know or we are told that prices are increasing, we know that that improvement from exchange rates must be greater than that kind of shift or the changes that were being caused by that shift in labor supply, or sorry, increase in labor supply, which was shifting our long run aggregate supply. If the reverse was true, the effect from exchange rates was less than the effect of labor supply. Well, now the effect of labor supply is going to win out or dominate, in which case this would cause our equilibrium prices to go down. So when we have these simultaneous changes, sometimes the answer is going to be it depends. We don't know what's happening to prices, but a different way that these problems or these questions could be structured is I tell you what happens to prices, in which case you can tell me which of those changes must have been larger. Okay. Any questions on that before we kind of dive into module 6? So a little bit of review there of shifts in our long run aggregate supply and shifts in our long run aggregate demand. Okay. So go back to the home page here. We'll pull up module 6 slides and we'll dive into module 6. So module 6, we're going to start to make a differentiation between long and short run prices and GDP. So if we are going back, we just kind of review this, that when I have shifts in long and aggregate supply, what happens? Well, that will change our real GDP in the long run, and it changes our price level. Okay. So this was going to be our kind of classical model. We didn't define it necessarily as this in module 5, but this is the model we were looking at. So it does a pretty good job of making predictions in the long run over a long period of time. Recessions would cause this long run aggregate supply decrease. Any increases in those factors of pull that we talked about would cause long run aggregate supply increases and have the exact opposite effects. So we kind of went through some examples of this today. Now, when we're talking about this, change in the long run equilibrium, we talk about it through like prices and real GDP. But anytime we have lower real GDP, companies don't need as many workers to kind of get to that level of level of output is lower. And so lower levels of real GDP, we would also see higher levels of unemployment and vice versa. Okay. So instead of thinking about, what's going to happen in real GDP, if I instead phrase this as what's happening in unemployment, those two things would work in opposite directions. When real GDP is lower, unemployment is higher, vice versa. Okay. So that was our classical model. That's kind of what we looked at last class and what we started out today with. So what are some shortcomings of this? Right? So it does a good job in the long run, but in the short run, we have what we call sticky prices. That we know that these long run shifts are going to cause changes in our long run price levels. The problem is companies and consumers can't necessarily adjust immediately to these changes in aggregate demand or changes in long run aggregate supply. So, for example, like why might this happen? Even if we see increases or decreases in long run aggregate supply, maybe companies and employees are locked into union contracts, and those contracts extend for a certain period of time, and so they can't change wages, right? Or they can't change their costs of production, so they don't change prices right away. Maybe we have something like an example I'll kind of use here is like cost and menu cost at a restaurant. So even if there's factors that change, increase or decrease our input prices, we might want to raise or lower the price of the product we're selling. It's costly to print menus, right? And even if I want to change them, I can't print them overnight, right? And so it's going to take some time for me to adjust to those shifts in long run aggregate supply, or we would say prices don't initially change right away. Now, another one could be that instead of changing just like the price of my product, maybe because there are higher levels of real GDP, or I can think about this as my input costs have went down, maybe I want to actually produce more than I was before, so I need larger production facilities, or maybe there's a new technology and I can really only employ it. I can only increase productivity if I have a larger facility. Well, I can't build that overnight. So I drive by this in Bloomington, it's Simtra. I don't even know what I think they produce pharmaceutical something or other, but uh, when I drive by, they've been working on changing their facility or their uh, building they're adding on to it. I mean, they've been working on this for 6 months, right? So they're trying to adjust, but they haven't been able to enact whatever this, new technology or whatever the factors that have changed that make them want to increase output. They can't increase their facility size overnight. And so they haven't been able to increase their output at the levels that they will eventually, right? Once they respond to these shifts by building this larger production facility. So these things take time, right? These adjustments take time. So in the short run, we would say that prices are sticky. We can't completely update our prices overnight. So this classical model doesn't predict this, right? It's assuming that we're in the long run, so we're seeing kind of complete responses to these shifts, right? So we know the classical model can't capture the idea of sticky prices. So there's this other model called the Keynesian model, where we think about kind of short run aggregate supply. So in the long run, we had this completely vertical supply curve, right? No matter what the price level was, companies respond immediately, and we get to this same level. As long as we have the same factors of production, we always are going to have the same potential or maximum real GDP. But in the short run, because they are responding to these changes in these different factors, if prices were completely sticky, we can't change them within 24 hours. Well, there, my price level is constant, right? So if my price level is constant, well, then if I saw an aggregate demand decrease, I can't respond right away, or prices don't respond right away. We actually would see real GDP decrease. And if I saw aggregate demand increase, if prices were completely sticky, we would see real GDP increases. So this is going to be the Keynesian model. So kind of compare and contrast these, right? If I saw aggregate demand increases or decreases, the Keynesian model predicts there's no changes in prices, or prices aren't able to update immediately. What is that going to do? It's going to cause real GDP changes. Well, remember, in the long run classical model, we said there was no change in real GDP, right? Doesn't matter if aggregate demand went up or down, we saw the same level of maximum or potential GDP. So we have these two models, right, that kind of lead us to different outcomes, right? And that's because one is really focusing on the long run, the other is focusing on changes in the short run. Now, when the classical model is good at explaining the long run, the Keynesian model isn't, right? And so we really want a combination of the two so we can explain changes that we see in the long and short run. So we're going to combine these two, right? These aggregate demand changes had very different um, not suggestions, but outcomes, right? In the two models. Okay. So we've got a vertical supply curve in the classical model, kind of a horizontal supply curve in the Keynesian model. We know that the truth, or kind of our model, should be somewhere in between. And so we're going to have kind of a short run aggregate demand, aggregate supply model that combines the two. Okay. So if my classical model had a completely vertical supply curve in the long run, my Keynesian model had a completely horizontal. If the truth is somewhere in the middle, then the slope of my short run aggregate supply is going to look something like this, right? Now, if you wanted to, you really could draw this as kind of just having the same slope. Although, if we were to extend this a little bit further, and this won't really change what we're going to look at in this class, but if we think about the response in the short run, and how much we're producing or the level of output, real GDP, when prices are relatively low, right? Changes, right, in real GDP, we're going to be kind of pretty responsive to that. It's like a larger percentage change. Whereas when prices are high, that same increase in price is a smaller percentage change. So we don't really increase GDP by as much, right? And so that as prices are lower, that slope is going to be flatter, or from small price changes, we're getting large changes in real GDP. And then when prices are higher, that same price increase is a smaller percentage. We're seeing a lower response to real GDP, which is why we kind of have not a linear curve here. It's changing. The rate at which it changes varies. But once again, for the sake of what we're doing in this class, I'll draw it out as kind of this upward sloping, not completely, doesn't have the same slope. But if you wanted to draw it in, having a consistent, constant slope, we'll end up with the same predictions. Okay. Questions on this before we keep moving? So this will be our short run aggregate supply model, or short run aggregate supply curve that we're going to be using in our model, kind of combined. Right? Well, you can imagine the short run, right? It's very similar to the long run. Our equilibrium is where aggregate demand hits aggregate supply. It's just that we were looking at the short run. In the long run, right, we know that we're still going to have the same level of potential or maximum GDP. So in the long run, we still have this vertical supply curve or aggregate supply curve. But we know that in the short run, prices can't adjust immediately. So our short run aggregate supply is going to be there as well, and it's increasing, right? As prices go up, companies are responding by producing more, but they can't completely update prices, or it takes time for them to change things in order to do that. So our long run equilibrium, all three of those things will be the same. Our short run aggregate supply is the same as our long run aggregate supply, producing the same level of potential or maximum GDP, and it's equal to our aggregate demand. Everything being produced in the short and long run of this is the same, and everyone who is demanding products, they're buying all of what is being created, all of output. So this is our long run kind of equilibrium. That includes not only our long run aggregate supply, but our short run aggregate supply curve as well. Okay. Questions here. Okay. All right. So I don't have as many of you here, so I'm trying to check on these. So this is what we're going to start out with. Okay. So one thing that we'll kind of work through first is a lot of the factors that we talked about that shift long run aggregate supply will also shift short run aggregate supply. So when we were talking about things like, in that O category, this was like not just capital, physical capital, this was land and natural resources. So if we see new raw materials or new natural resources, this is going to increase both our long run aggregate supply, but anything that's kind of impacting that long run aggregate supply would also shift our short run aggregate supply. And this is one of those. Right? I said usually I'll use the example of physical capital, but technically in that O category, we had anything other than productivity, labor, and education. And a good example of this, I tried to look at the year, and it was like in the early 2000s, but graphene was like a new raw material that was discovered to be very useful in the production of electronic products. So it increased the productivity of our workers because they now have this new raw material that allows them to make these products more effectively than before. Increased levels of competition. That's once again something in this other category. When we have higher levels of competition, firms have to uh, want to make sure people are purchasing their products, so they increase, right, um, the overall level of production, right? They're trying to make sure that people buy from them. They're improving, investing more into physical capital and technologies. And so that would also kind of cause an increase or a shift in both. Removal of trade barriers or fewer business regulations. We didn't really touch on these. This would technically be kind of in that other category. Because if you think about it, if we remove trade barriers, we now are competing. There's more competition between us and other countries. It's once again kind of like increased competition that would increase both our aggregate supply and aggregate demand curves. Fewer business regulations, same kind of idea, increases competition. Any increase in our labor supply, that was one of the other factors of pull, and any increase in education or skill levels. Excuse me. So if we had one of these factors change, what happens, right, to real GDP and prices if we have one of these things that changes and increases both of them, right? So I'll kind of work through this model, then draw one out. If it decreases, I'll just use the slides here. But if we saw something that impacts or increases both long run aggregate supply and short run aggregate supply, well, where is our new equilibrium point? Well, in the long and short run, if both of these shift, our new equilibrium price is going to be lower, or we have deflation, and our new real GDP is going to be higher than it was before. Okay, so it's the same kind of outcome we got when we just saw a shift in our long run aggregate supply. If there's something that shifts both our long and short run aggregate supply, we get the same directional changes here as we did when we just had changes in long run aggregate supply. Now, I want to go through this in a slightly different way. And here we'll think about it when we have decreases in long run aggregate supply and short run aggregate supply simultaneously. So if one of these things in pull changes such that wherever we initially started out at, so we've got our aggregate demand, we kind of had this long run aggregate supply, and now we have this short run aggregate supply. So our initial price level was here, our initial real GDP was here. If we saw something that decreased both of these, right? So maybe this is a decrease in our labor supply. We would see, once again, a leftward shift represents that we're seeing a decrease in supply. So our new long run aggregate supply and our new short run aggregate supply are here. That would push prices up, but cause our real GDP to decrease. Okay. Now, when we're thinking about these shifts, I want to give a slightly different way of thinking about this because they might seem counterintuitive. Decreases in our aggregate supply look like shifts to the left. It looks like the curve is increasing. When we just had long run aggregate supply, it kind of made sense. Decreases are shifts to the left. But with our short run aggregate supply, it can be a little bit confusing. So I think a better way of thinking about this, and I'll try to keep this on the same all so you can see all of it here, is if I'm thinking about just my short run aggregate supply. So let's say I had my short run aggregate supply initially was here, and my new short run aggregate supply is right here. So if short run aggregate supply is decreasing, we can think of it two ways. So why might I want to produce less, right? Well, if input prices go up, then at the same price level that I'm selling my product for, well, I'm generating the same revenue, but all the units I'm producing are now more costly, then I actually want to supply less. So when my input prices increase, right, that actually decreases my short run aggregate supply, right? The price stays the same. So at any given price level here that I'm looking at, because it's more costly to produce this good, I'm going to want to supply less. You can also think about the reverse, right? So let's say I have input prices. Well, actually, sorry, we'll do it this way. So I still have input prices going up. Another way of thinking about this is to get the same level of output, real GDP, when input prices are higher, excuse me, I would require higher prices for that product than I did before. Think about it this way. If initially I can sell a product for $10 and my input prices are $10, I'm breaking even. But if it now costs me $20 to make that, in order for me to want to sell it, I'd have to at least be able to sell it for 20. So two different ways of thinking about when we have these changes in input prices, higher input prices lead to kind of lower levels of short run aggregate supply, which look like shifts upward, right? So you might confuse that with, oh, supply is increasing. No, shifts up and to the left actually represent higher input prices or represent that I'm going to want to supply less than I was before. So kind of just two different ways of thinking about why those shifts in aggregate, short run aggregate supply are a little bit confusing or counterintuitive. Okay. Any questions on that before we kind of keep moving here? Okay. So those are our kind of things that would change um, our short and long run aggregate supply. So we kind of worked through those. I did the decrease example for us right there. Now let's think about turn our attention to not shifts in both of these supply curves, but just a shift in our aggregate demand curve. And now we're going to differentiate between the short and the long run. So here I've got an aggregate demand increase. What is that going to do? Okay. So I'm going to draw this out. I've got it in the slides here, but I think let me make sure. Well, I'll come back to this. All right, this is the complete model. I'm going to build this out. I think being able to kind of draw this step by step, although I think my, animations are helpful in the slides. I think because we're meeting here live, I think it's useful for me to kind of show you how you would draw this for yourself, and also makes it a little bit easier to point some things out than just pointing to the screen with my mouse. So if we've got this model, I've got my initial aggregate demand. Let's say here's my long run aggregate supply. Here's my short run aggregate supply curve. Okay. So initially we start out, here was the price in the long run, and it was the same as the price in my short run. Here, this was going to be my real GDP in the long run, and it was the exact same as my real GDP in the short run. This is my initial kind of starting point. If we see an increase in aggregate demand, so this would be something like, let's say, and this would be kind of how I said the problem, maybe on like the quiz. So I also will mention here, we'll get up some practice problems. Um, and they should be posted before tomorrow's class, if not by the end of the day tomorrow. So you can kind of start to review these and kind of go through these questions. But I might do something like say, okay, assume that taxes decrease, right? Actually, I think I already kind of did a tax one. Let's assume that real interest rates decrease. Well, if they decrease, once again, we always want to think about these things through the lens of a consumer. That means that if I borrow money, the costs of borrowing have went down, right? Or if I have a loan, the total amount I'm paying goes down, which means I have more money left to spend on other products or increase my expenditures. So this would cause an increase in my aggregate demand curve or a shift to the right. So what is that going to do? Well, in the short run, the point where my new aggregate demand hits my short run aggregate supply is going to be at a higher price level, but it's also going to be at a higher level of real GDP. So in the short run, right, that aggregate demand increase is going to cause my prices in the short run to go up, and it's also going to cause my real GDP in the short run to increase. Okay. However, right, that's the short run, and prices and all of the factors of we haven't updated, right? There's some sticky prices or facilities that we can't change these overnight. Now, as things change, and we'll focus more on what is going to change to get us to this point tomorrow and Thursday's class. But in the long run, where do we know the equilibrium is going to end up? Well, in the short run, it could be here, but in the long run, right? We know that the new equilibrium will be somewhere where, or sorry, will be at the point where the new aggregate demand hits our original long run aggregate supply because long run aggregate supply hasn't changed because of these real interest rates. So if we know the price is going to be higher in the long run than it currently is, we know then that over time or moving towards the long run, prices are going to be higher than they currently are. So if prices in the long run we know are going to increase, right? We've got expectations that there's going to be inflation. And so the fact that real GDP today in the short run is not the real GDP we're going to get to in the long run, we would say there's a gap. Right? So anytime the real GDP in the short run is not the same as the long run real GDP, we say that there's a kind of gap here. So in this case, we had short run real GDP being greater than long run real GDP. That created a gap. There was a gap in this output. What type of gap? Well, if we think that there's going to be more inflation or prices are going to go up in the future, we are expecting inflation, we would call this gap in real GDP an inflationary gap. And we'll go through a little bit more of this throughout the next couple of days. But for right now, the way we can think about this is if the real level of GDP is higher in the short run than the long run, we're going to have an inflationary gap. Another way of thinking about this is the price that we currently see in the short run. Well, let me color code these. The price that we currently see in the short run is less than that price we know that we're going to get to in the long run, in which case prices are going to increase, sorry, which is another reason or another way to remember this is an inflationary gap. This gap in GDP is existing because we know there's going to be inflation moving from the short to the long run. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving? Okay. So just to kind of once again take this slow and make sure that we're having a good understanding, I'm going to draw out the next one as well. And everything kind of just gets flipped, right? So let's say I had my real GDP here. I've got my prices. I've got my aggregate demand curve. I've got long run aggregate supply. And I've got my short run. So these initial kind of long run prices and my initial short run prices and my long run initial GDP and my short run initial GDP are right here. What if instead I saw that, oh, what do I want here? Let's say expected future income goes down. So once again, we're kind of combining things we talked about in module 5 with this new model. So if we think there's going to be lower income in the future, what will consumers do today? They're actually going to buy less, or we have this decrease in our aggregate demand. Okay. So this decrease in aggregate demand is going to do what? Well, in the short run, where does my aggregate demand hit my short run aggregate supply curve? Well, my new price in the short run is right here. My new real GDP in the short run is right here. So in the short run, what has happened, right? I've seen in the short run, prices have went down, right? My short run prices have decreased, and my short run real GDP has also decreased. Okay. Now I'll notice here, I should have, sorry, put short run here. I'll notice that my new short run GDP is now less than my long run real GDP. So once again, I have a gap that's being caused in my current level, short run GDP, compared to where we know in the long run we'll get back to that maximum or potential level of GDP in our economy. So we have this gap. My output is actually too low. So there's another way of thinking about this. I think it helps with this one, as opposed to inflationary gap. It's maybe easier to remember in this model or this example. So when I have an aggregate demand decrease, if my real GDP is lower than where I know GDP is going to get to in the long run, this gap is being caused because output is too low. And we will sometimes call this a recessionary gap. Now, another synonymous term is going to be that because my short run price, where do I know prices are going to get to in the long run? Where my long run aggregate supply hits my new aggregate demand curve. So I actually know that in the long run, my new price is going to be down here. So the current price in the short run is actually too high. So I know that in the future, prices are going to fall, moving towards the long run. So another word we would have for this is not a recessionary gap. I spelled this right. Yeah. A deflationary gap. These kind of two terms are synonymous. Now we'll talk about something later on where we typically think about a recessionary gap from a slightly different standpoint than something else that could change. But ultimately, a recessionary gap, the same thing. It's the same thing as calling it a deflationary gap. It's just kind of thinking about, here when output is lower, it's easier to think about as a recession. If prices we know are going to currently too high, we know they're going to be lower in the future. Maybe it's easier to think about as a deflationary gap. So I'm never going to like give you these two terms at the same time because they're interchangeable. Okay. Any questions on anything that we've got here? Okay. So where are we at time? I think we're setting this up pretty good. So here's kind of that model that I basically just drew out when we have aggregate demand increases. We then went through aggregate demand decrease example. Um, we're also going to think about other changes. So this kind of summarizes what we just drew out. So someone asked me in the previous section, like, do I memorize these? I mean, you can. I think it helps to draw the graphs out. Also, once we start to combine these with aggregate supply changes, there's just going to be more moving parts. So there's going to be more combinations. So like if you think about this as like a outcome tree, like a decision tree type thing, you're just going to have more combinations that you'd have to memorize. I think it's going to be difficult to do it that way. I think drawing these aggregate demand increases and decreases out is going to be helpful in determining that kind of relationship, sorry, between short run and long run prices, and then short run and long run real GDP. Okay. But this is just kind of summarizing those. On the exam, you're going to ask these questions with picture. Yeah, so just words. So this is where being able to reproduce these graphs on your own, that's going to be um, very helpful and very useful. Okay. So you should know how to draw in aggregate demand increases and decreases. And after that, identify short versus long run equilibrium prices and GDP. So, this class gets harder as we move along. Okay. All right. So the next type of changes that we want to think about is not changes to aggregate demand, but changes to our short run aggregate supply. So we talked about some of the things that could cause aggregate long run and short run aggregate supply to both change, right? And we then talked about the resulting price and GDP changes. But what if we just have think about this as like a temporary shock, right? So it's not going to impact long run aggregate supply. It's only going to impact short run aggregate supply. So the way I'll kind of set this up, maybe a good way to think about this, what is something that would impact supply in the short run, but not the long run? Well, let's say we have the same number of workers. And if you go back, one of the things I had in one of the slides is that long run aggregate supply assumes the natural rate of unemployment. But we know the economy has like cycles to it, and that yes, if we averaged out over the long run these ebbs and flows of the economy, we end up at kind of this natural rate of unemployment. But at any one point in time, the economy could be at a slight downturn or a slight upturn. And so, in any short run, in any 1 week or 1 month, we might have an increase or kind of decrease in the economic conditions, which would influence short run aggregate supply. But over the long run, they kind of average out, and we're back at that like long run natural rate of unemployment. But in any one point in time, unemployment captures this cyclical unemployment, so it may be higher or lower. We said employment is kind of synonymous with real GDP, right? Lower levels of employment or higher levels of unemployment would lead to us being able to produce lower levels of output. Now, once we remove that cyclical unemployment over time, we're kind of back to where we should be at on that long run aggregate supply curve. Using all of our resources, assuming we have no cyclical unemployment, that's where we should be at. But in the short run, that's not the case. So I think I've got drawn in here kind of what happens if we have aggregate supply decreases. I'm going to draw these out for us once again. You could be expected to do this. And so I think these are going to be how you're solving a lot of these problems. So I think it'd be helpful. So let me make sure I do, what did I have in the slides first? Okay. So we've got a real GDP, the relationship between that and prices. I've got my aggregate demand curve. I've got my long run aggregate supply curve. Let's assume we start out here in equilibrium. So this is going to be my long run initial price, my short run initial price, my real GDP in the long run, and my real GDP initially in the short run. Okay. So we're starting out in equilibrium. And now instead of an aggregate demand change, we're going to see a supply shock. So this first one is going to think about, let's say we have a negative supply shock, or that the economy is right now kind of on the downturn, or we can almost think about this as a current short run recession. Well, if we have a negative supply shock, that's going to decrease the short run aggregate supply, right? So this might be something like currently we have just fewer workers. That means in this short run, we have fewer workers to produce output. At every price level, our output decreases. So that's one way of thinking about that when we're just focusing on the short run aggregate supply curve earlier. So if that's the case, we have this negative supply shock, and I'm going to try to draw this out pretty extreme here. So it decreased our short run aggregate supply. In the short run, where is our new equilibrium point where our short run aggregate supply hits aggregate demand? Our new short run price is here. Okay. So what did that short run aggregate supply decrease do? It increased our prices, and it also decreased our real GDP. Okay. Now we have a scenario now where my short run real GDP is less than what we know the long run real GDP will be. Because in the long run, once these factors of production, companies, consumers can adjust to this kind of higher short run price, we're going to end up getting back to that long run equilibrium, right? This is the kind of the cycles of our economy. Every recession is typically matched with an improvement in economic conditions. So we should end up back at this long run outcome. So the fact that our short run GDP is not the same as our long run GDP, we've got a gap. What type of gap is it? Well, there's kind of two ways to think about this. The first is we know that currently output is too low. So I said, usually you can think about, help you to remember that this would be a recessionary gap. Now we said another synonymous term for this would be it's a deflationary gap. But why? Well, in the long run, right, where are um, where are prices going to get to? Well, there's no change in aggregate demand. So if we get back to this long run aggregate supply, sorry, let me turn the phone off here. Um, then the point where long run aggregate supply is equal to my aggregate demand is still at this same point. So compared to the current short run price, we know that price levels are going to return to those long run prices. So in the long run, there's no change in price from these short run aggregate supply changes. Prices are going to fall. So if prices fall, or if we think about my short run prices are currently too high, they'll fall back to my long run levels. I've got a gap, a, a deflationary gap. So two different ways of thinking about this gap when we have kind of negative shocks to our economy. We would call this an recessionary or a deflationary gap. Okay. Any questions there before we keep moving? Okay. So on the opposite side of things, right, let's assume instead that I saw, give me 1 second here. Got something on my screen I need to get rid of. So let's assume instead that I'm looking at this model. I've got real GDP here. I've got prices here. Got my initial aggregate demand. I've got my initial kind of long run aggregate supply. I've got my initial short run aggregate supply. My starting kind of long run and short run price are right here. And my real GDP in the long run and my real GDP in the short run are right here. Okay. What if instead I saw a positive shock? Right. So let's say economic conditions are good. Employers are going to hire more workers. So I see, lower levels of unemployment, right? And I see a positive shock to my economy. That's going to mean that to get the same level of output, I have lower input prices or lower costs, or to get if prices kind of remain the same, I can get to a higher level of output. So there we said that would result in an increase in our short run aggregate supply. What does this increase do? Well, it pushes our short run prices down, but pushes our short run, excuse me, excuse me, real GDP up, in which case our long run real GDP is still at this vertical, aggregate long run aggregate supply curve. So we know that real GDP will return to this level once factors of production can adjust over time, right? Prices aren't sticky forever, if you think about it that way. So in this case, our long run real GDP is actually less than our new kind of short run real GDP. And if it helps here, I'm comparing it to kind of that new short run real GDP. So we've got a gap, but what's causing this gap? Well, in the long run, where do I know prices will return? Where long run aggregate supply is equal to aggregate demand. So we know price levels are going to get back to this point. So from the current price, we know prices are going to increase, right? Currently, prices, once again, I could think about this as like my new short run prices. If that's the case, if prices are going to go up moving towards the long run, we could think about that as inflation. So I have an inflationary gap. Currently, output is too high, right? I know prices will kind of rise until we get back to that long run real GDP outcome. And so we would call this gap in real GDP an inflationary gap. Okay. Any questions on that idea? Okay. Let me think if there's anything else I want to say here. I think that should cover it. Let me see if there's anything else I want to say. Um, so I think what I'll do here is I know that next class I want to revisit kind of these concepts, but we're going to do instead simultaneous changes. So I'm going to hold off on that today. We've looked at what occurs from an aggregate demand increase, what occurs from an aggregate demand decrease, and then what happens if we see a short run aggregate supply increase or a short run aggregate supply decrease. So I would expect you to know how to be able to identify the changes to short and long run equilibriums from each of those types of changes. All right. Next class will combine the two, and similar to what we were looking at the beginning of class today, a lot of the answers are going to be it depends, and the relative size of those shifts is going to matter. Okay. Um, so unless there's any other questions, say where are we at on time here? I got done quite a bit earlier than I expected today. Um, so is there anything else that we could do to make use of this extra time? Let's think about, well, the fact that we have extra time, I'm going to go ahead and at least introduce the idea of what's happening with simultaneous shifts. And I'm going to complicate it a little bit next class, but we'll at least get like a first look at it. Okay. So let's say that I have a positive shock to my current economy or my current short and aggregate supply. Well, at the same time, I see real interest rates increase. And I think I'll kind of notate this as red, and we'll kind of look at this as blue. Now, you could draw these out on the same graph. Um, I will do that right now, and then we'll focus more on tomorrow doing this on separate graphs so that we don't end up with a goofy scenario. So today we'll look at one where it seems like, how is this possible? We'll talk through it more tomorrow as to why we could end up with this result. So let's say I'm thinking about, here's my real GDP, here's prices, here's my current aggregate demand, here's my current long run aggregate supply, and here's my current short run aggregate supply. We start out with here's my prices in the short run, and here's my real GDP in the short run. And then we've got this long run, so we know this is going to be my GDP in the long run. And we're starting out here, short and long run prices will be the same, right? We're in this equilibrium. So what is the real interest rate going up going to do? Well, we said if real interest rates go up, it's now more costly to borrow. It's not cheaper, right? And so if it's more costly to borrow, I'm going to have less money left over to spend on products. And so you can think about, what is that going to do? It's going to cause an aggregate demand decrease. Okay. Now, initially, we might think, okay, if that's the only thing that occurs, this would be my new price in the short run, where aggregate demand hits my aggregate supply curve. But if at the same time I see a positive shock to my economy, what is that going to do? Well, here we had an aggregate demand decrease. A positive shock would essentially lower my current input prices or my current cost of production, which would mean that to get the same level of output, I would require a lower price or the same price of the good. I would now be willing to supply more to the market. So if now I see that this positive shock causes my short run aggregate supply to increase, remember, a little bit counterintuitive, but increases are always shifts to the right. Right? Now it looks like it's moving down and to the right, but it's always a shift to the right. We kind of talked through the reasons earlier. Two different ways of thinking about why earlier. Okay. So if this is the case, where is our new short run price and where's our new short run real GDP? Well, notice the point where my short run aggregate supply is equal to my new aggregate demand, I actually end up at the same level of short and long run GDP. So there's no change in my real GDP here in the long and the short run. However, what has occurred, my short run prices are now lower, but also my long run prices doesn't matter what my short run cost curves are. It's where the new aggregate demand hits my long run aggregate supply. So we end up with, if both of these things happen simultaneously, it's going to lower both my short run and long run prices. Whereas before, this relationship of GDP and the relationship of price told me if we had an inflation or a deflationary gap. Here, those are exactly the same. So if these simultaneous changes completely offset each other, we could end up in a scenario where we have no inflationary or no deflationary or recessionary gap, right? Um, so that is possible, right? If we had simultaneous changes, even if they're working in opposite directions, if they were to cause the exact same percentage change in prices and GDP, we'd end up at this point where there is no difference between our short and our long run. Okay. Now, next class, we'll talk about some more difficult scenarios where the relative size of these, right, one is larger than the other, and how we would then determine, do we have an inflationary or a deflationary gap? And then we will also talk about, okay, if we have an inflationary or deflationary gap, what are the responses of our economy to that, and how do we then arrive back at this long run outcome? Okay. So that should cover it for us today. I'm going to end there. So I'm going to stop the recording